Let's jump into it. Marc, it's great to be with you. I know we're here to talk about ESG instead of Christmas. Maybe we'll have the Christmas webinar next week. Just let's get started with quick introductions. I'll start, Marc, and hand it over to you. I'm Conrad Smith. I'm 25 years as a procurement practitioner. I started at Intel, was there about 15 years, and then I went over to Adobe. I was the head of purchasing at Adobe for 10 years. And then about 2019, I left Adobe and founded Graphite and built the team and the product here. It's been really cool. And in my journeys, I met you, Marc. So why don't you tell us a little bit about you, and then we'll jump in and get rolling here.
Brilliant. Thanks, Conrad. Yeah, so my name's Marc, founder of DitchCarbon. My background's predominantly in software as a service businesses, so growing businesses in marketing and tech. Kind of really just kind of had that moment a few years ago where I really wanted to do more to help fight climate change. And when you look into it, you realize that procurement people really are the unsung potential climate heroes, right? And so we've built a product that works really great for procurement people, and that's why I think we partnered so well with Graphite Connect. So happy to be here, and hopefully we can answer some questions in the deck that we put together. But also leave plenty of space at the end for some QA. So hopefully you'll leave this session, more informed, more able to take action on climate, and really drive forward your green agenda within whatever company you're in.
That's awesome. And I would just say, in the point of housekeeping, if you have any questions along the way, don't hesitate to put them into the chat. Here in Zoom, just pop your questions in there. We'll try and keep an eye on as we go. And at the end, we'll kind of pop back over there and do a quick review of those, as well as kind of open it up to kind of verbal questions. It's nice to have everybody with us. So we want to go ahead and launch a quick survey. Let's share the results. There you go. Can you see that there now? So
yeah, brilliant. So that's really interesting. So it's kind of what we expect. The majority of companies haven't yet set any net zero objectives. Most people know some things. A few people very well informed, and a little nothing in terms of supplier intelligence so far. Really interesting. That's fascinating. Thank you all for taking the time to do that. Let's crack on and go through the presentation then, Conrad. So I guess I kind of alluded to this in the introduction, but up to 95% of a company's total carbon footprint will come just from what it buys. That's enormous. And if you think about global greenhouse gas emissions, so out of all the emissions that the whole of humanity emit, 60% of it comes through what companies buy. That's an enormous part of solving the climate change challenge. And as more companies are regulated to reduce their emissions or pay, it becomes increasingly important that we address that issue. And that's why procurement people are absolutely at the forefront of this stuff. You'll have the skills to negotiate with suppliers, to drive change within suppliers. You know the market incredibly well. You are the perfect people to optimize for carbon in your supply chain, and therefore can have the biggest impact on your company's reductions. And as I say, every company has signed up to be net zero by 2050. So sooner or later, every company in the world will have to seriously look at what it buys and reduce the carbon footprint that exists within that.
Now, Marc, I remember talking to the corporate ESG folks about all of this a couple of years ago when I was at Adobe, and they're talking about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. It was all pretty like a totally new language for me. Can you just take a few minutes and walk through this in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember talking to Jacob about this on the stand in London, actually. So there's a few different key things to remember when you're talking about different scopes of emissions. So scope 1 is direct emissions. So I'm a company, I am burning fossil fuels in order to let me do what I do as a company, right? So that might be heating your office with a gas boiler. It might be putting fuel in your trucks to go and deliver stuff. It might be, heating up a furnace to make something, right? So you're literally setting a light to emission, to some kind of fossil fuel as part of your main business. Scope 2 is imported energy. So that's most of the time electricity. So I've got power that's coming into my factory, into my warehouse, into my office. that energy is being generated somewhere else. And there are carbon emissions associated with that. So that will vary dependent on your energy supplier. And it ranges, there's a huge range in this globally. So if you think about per unit of energy, that's a kilowatt hour. In Sweden, it's as low as around 30 grams. And in Jacksonville, it sticks in my head because it's about 800 grams. So there's an enormous difference around the world in terms of the how carbon intense it is to use energy. And then scope 3 is everything else. And that can be purchasing, as we've already spoken about, but also if you finance other companies, you franchise other companies, and business travel is often a large part of scope 3 as well. As you'd expect, because we're partnering with Graphite Connect, the main focus of this is going to be on purchasing. But it's important to know how that fits into the broader context of how companies have to report their emissions.
So, Mark, what is typical in a company? I mean, I think I remember that scope 3 is like the biggest of all of these groups. Like, what do you normally see in terms of the percentages? And do the percentages vary dramatically, or is there some really strong patterns?
Yeah, so I think unless you're manufacturing big dirty things, so as in if you're in mineral extraction or something like that, then your scope 1 is going to be pretty significant for those sorts of companies. But for services, IT, retailers, all those sorts of people, scope 1 and scope 2 are normally pretty insignificant. Scope 3 is really where it's all at. And what's so interesting about the way that this is measured is that it puts the responsibility on the person buying the thing, not necessarily the person making the thing or the company making the thing. Because you're a large organization, you're the first one that's going to be regulated. If you're buying in products that are highly carbon intensive, that's going to show up on your reporting. And so therefore you are incentivized to find lower carbon options for that same product. That's a very interesting way of doing it. And this is all, by the way, from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is the kind of the leading standards maker in this. So like all of that's kind of quite detailed. And you can look down and see, well, what's the individual carbon footprint of a particular product, or from a generic point of view, or maybe even that specific product. What journey did it take to get from where it was made to me, and what's the carbon intensity of that? But for the purposes of procurement, carbon intensity is a really useful metric to think about, and that is per thing that I buy from this supplier, how carbon intensive is that? And that might be per dollar. So if I'm buying services specifically, or if you buy services specifically, it's very useful to look at it from a carbon intensive point of view. So comparing IT service providers or consultants, per dollar you spend with them, how many grams of carbon are they emitting? And so you'll hear me talk about that. What's the carbon intensity of company A versus company B? And that's worked out by looking at their total carbon footprint and their total revenue, dividing one into the other, so that for each dollar you spend with Accenture, Deloitte, it's a few grams or whatever. We can go through those numbers later, but that's why carbon intensity is quite useful, because it's a great rule of thumb for working out which supplier is going to help you get on that net zero journey faster.
So I can't remember if you want to talk about this later, Mark, but when we spoke ahead of this meeting, you were talking about sort of a carbon intensity report similar to a spend report, and how the two of those blend together.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's something we probably pick up a little bit later, actually. Okay. I think I would just very briefly make the point, perhaps, that you need all the data that you have on that supplier, but you also need the carbon intensity. And I think we're going to lead into talking about your golden record and how that works. That's probably the better place to talk about, actually, Conrad. I'm going to step back from that. Should we go to the next slide, though?
Yeah, sure.
So I guess, where do we start, right? So thinking about measuring what the carbon footprint is of your suppliers, how big is your problem, and who are your problems, is a really good place to start. And then I think we're going to talk about this a bit more later on, but like building a consensus within your organization as to how much you're willing to pay to get a lower carbon option. Now, there are some where it's cheaper to go lower carbon. So electricity energy production is generally cheaper if it's green. Whereas if you think about jet fuel, it's about 1,000 times more expensive right now. So there's a huge variation in lower carbon options and what the different pricing is on them. But you need to decide as an organization, perhaps we're willing to pay 5% more if it means that we get a lower carbon option. But being really clear and getting buy-in from senior leadership about what they're willing to pay is essential, because otherwise it becomes a bit of an internal greenwashing exercise and you never really make any changes. But once you've got that, you can start building this into your supplier profiles.
So Mark, you and I have sort of built a partnership out here between our two companies, because we look at the supplier data very holistically, right? We're really focused on the gathering and manage of commercial data, but alongside that, all the risk and due diligence data that companies needs to gather, manage, and track in relation, as they manage all of their suppliers, all the areas, privacy, security, in this case, sort of environmental concerns and ESG concerns. So we have this golden record, and within Graphite now, we've enabled the ability to display the DitchCarbon data, like the summary level analysis of everything that you're collecting and managing. And we'll talk a little bit more about the full scope of what that means, but that allows us then to layer in this carbon data directly into each of the supplier profiles in a powerful way that enables, really good visibility of summary level information. This kind of provides yellow flag, red flag kind of concerns. Hey, this is a supplier where there might be really high carbon intensity impact, so I need to dive in deeper. This is a supplier that can actually have a material impact on my ability to to drive this scope 3 emissions that we're talking about. So this is the integration that we've built between our data, our platform and your data set. And maybe you can take a few minutes and let's talk about where this data comes from and how it's updated, and all of those considerations.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to reinforce the point, like you can't be expected to kind of be making a decision on a supplier, onboarding a supplier, and then have to go somewhere else to then work out whether they're good from a sustainability point of view, because you can't look at that stuff completely in isolation. And that's why this kind of works kind of so well. So just talking about what we do, we essentially capture disclosures wherever they are made, as long as they're kind of publicly available. So that might be via CDP, it might be via a local carbon accounting firm, it might be on their company's website itself. We then draw that data in alongside any initiative participation, so SBTI, UN Sustainable Development Group, CDP, whoever it is, and so you can get a complete picture on that company's carbon footprint and what action they're taking on climate. We then provide that summary level data, which Conrad showed on the previous slide, for every single company in the Graphite Connect database. So any company will get this sort of ranking, whether they've disclosed or not. So you can kind of do that RAG style right at the beginning. And then if you want to dip into more information, we can give you everything you need in terms of understanding what that profile is. And I think we detail that on the next slide. So we look at that. Yeah, so we can see all of your suppliers, we can see how carbon intensive they are, we can see them compared to their peers, we can see their initiative participation, we can see what the category trends are for what they're doing as well. And more recently, I think that's on the next slide again, we can do
so before we jump there, let me just highlight that what this means is sort of within Graphite, you get the summary information. You click on the link for more information, and then this is where you start unlocking this very rich set of data where you're pulling it from all of these different sources.
And I guess from day one, anyone that's a Graphite Connect user can log in and start seeing, right, who are the problem ones based on that red, amber, green. And if you want to delve into it more deeply, brilliant, connect to us and get the full data set. And you get 25 companies absolutely free, just clicking on that QR code that's Trinstons helpfully put on the deck for you. Yeah, and then I guess taking it to the yeah. So there's actually another part that I was going to talk about, which is actually recommendations. So talking about for each and every one of your suppliers, what are the things that they should be doing in order to further reduce their carbon footprint? So you can go from not knowing anything about your suppliers to who are the problem ones, who are reducing, where do I need to spend more time talking about them and negotiating? And for all the rest of them, we can just give you exactly what they should be doing to further reduce their emissions without you having to engage directly.
Okay, so and this is not planned, so I'm sorry if this puts you on the spot, but I'm thinking back to the survey we put in the beginning and said, what do you know about your supplier's carbon? And if I heard what you just said right, like all you have to do is get into this level of data, and you all of a sudden you could say, okay, this is the top of my supply chain in terms of which ones have carbon impact and which ones don't.
Yeah, who do you need to worry about, right? Because most people, my experience, and actually Conrad, you probably talk to this better than I can, but people have got a very large supplier base normally if you count every single supplier, but actually they're probably proactively managing, you know, maybe 20% of those, right? And you want to make sure that the 20% that you're proactively managing are the same top 20% in terms of carbon, because they may not necessarily be the same thing. So they need to be on your radar so you can start engaging and understanding what they're doing to reduce their emissions before you get regulated and have to start paying for it.
Oh, this is awesome. And this 25 supplier free trial or whatever, like this is really cool. So we'll have Trinston send this out with follow-up to all the attendees in the webinar as well, so that it isn't just kind of lost in the deck here.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Conrad.
Sure. So there's a lot here, right? I mean, I know I'm sure there's people on the phone that are like, oh, okay, I knew most of this stuff already, because there was a couple of people that are, I think, probably more mature in the process of their understanding of ESG and carbon. But I think for most people, and most people in procurement, this whole thing is a little bit nebulous. How do I get started? So, you know, taking a step back and just simplifying it a little and saying, okay, I actually want to make this a thing for me next year within my team. How are you recommending? Maybe talk through these key bullets that you're suggesting.
Yeah, absolutely. First thing, as I mentioned it before, really, but like get buy-in, right? Because I think a lot of good intentions can go into this stuff, but if you're not saying, look, I need a budget to understand what my carbon footprint is, and then, you know, what's our appetite for reduction? You know, do we want to be aggressive on this? Do we want to sign up to SBTI? Do we want to you know, set aside a budget? Do we want to just incentivize people on our next RFP to give us their data? You know, what kind of points, what kind of scoring do you want to give associated with that? But getting that from leadership is really important. You can measure the suppliers. We've already spoken about how easy it is to do that. Focus on the large ones. You know, there will be large emitters within your supply chain that you need to have a conversation with and say, look, we've done a first pass. You are our top emitter. What are your plans? You know, and if their plans are, we're not doing anything, we don't care. Well, and you're serious about reducing your emissions, then maybe that's something that you need to start reviewing in your next contract review with them. You know, so really focus on the ones where you have the biggest impact. The next one is stop the rot. And this is where it really makes so much sense. It's so much easier to select suppliers based on this criteria than change the behavior of existing ones. And in that way, you can integrate it into your business as usual. So when you're reviewing suppliers on a quarterly basis, when you're looking at your spend, as Conrad alluded to earlier on, you know, we spent X. What are our emissions that are associated with that? Is it going up? Is it going down? Look at your category managers. You know, they've got a budget in terms of spend, in terms of, I'm sure, many other metrics, but let's include carbon on that as well. And again, you can get that data directly from something like Graphite Connect or DitchCarbon. And then you can really start accelerating your reductions. There's loads of information that we've shared about current legislation, both in North America and the EU, and how that impacts people all around the world. So if you need some more information to kind of go get that buy-in, then please drop into our blog or just kind of get in touch. We're happy to have the conversation. But I think it's like, yeah, getting buy-in, starting the measurements, get your quick wins with some of those bigger ones potentially. Make sure you're not onboarding any more dirty suppliers. Then integrate it into your KPIs, into your reviews internally, so you can really kind of create that kind of culture change when it comes to reducing your emissions.
Yeah. Outstanding.
Definitely.
Mark, thank you for all of this this background and introduction and additional resources here. There's a lot here behind this QR code. I was out there browsing around the other day. There's tons of information, as Mark talked about. So kind of continue your learning journey there. For those of you that are already users inside of Graphite, there's a question on the chat here. If a company is an IT product reseller, so let's start with this first question, Mark. If a company is an IT product reseller, that means they don't build anything specifically, right? Like software services. What would we consider when trying to calculate scope 3? Category 1 purchased goods and service emissions, or kind of what's your...
Yeah, absolutely. So you're buying in stuff, right? So anything that you buy and then pass on to your customers, whether you amend it in any way or not, is part of your category 1. So I'm guessing you buy from the big IT manufacturers, Stacey. So the good thing about that is that they all have published really good data on what they are emitting and what their carbon intensity is and what their reduction plans are. So for you as an IT, I mean, you're going to have very little scope 1, very little scope 2, very little of anything, I would imagine. Maybe some logistics stuff, but it's going to be that purchase goods and services is going to be the most interesting thing to you. And actually, you can go a level deeper if you want. IT equipment is one of the sectors that has disclosed a lot of product level data. So you can get even more accurate if you want to. So you can look at, well, I'm buying Dell equipment, that's great. But actually, you'll be able to find out, with our help, what the carbon footprint is of the specific products that you're buying and passing on. So there's a real opportunity there for you to show that to your customers and show the reductions that you're making. It's really fascinating, actually. The difference between a high spec laptop and a medium spec laptop can be almost twice. So I'm using a MacBook Air here. I think it's about 300 kilograms of carbon it takes to make this laptop. If I was to go for a top spec MacBook Pro with a big screen, that could be as much as 600-700 kilograms of carbon. So there's a real difference, and it's about just kind of making your buyers and the people internally aware of that stuff, so they can make more sustainable choices.
So, Mark, I'm curious. I'm a little bit more familiar with supplier diversity, and I know with like tier 2 supplier diversity, I take a percentage of their total carbon based on the revenue I spend with them. It's sort of like a percentage calculator, and I get my pro forma allocation of their total carbon footprint, because unless I'm going down to a product level specifically, like you're talking about, is that how it works? Where you're talking about carbon intensity per dollar. So if that company's total carbon footprint is, X, and I'm like 0.5% of their total revenue, then I get 0.5% of X is the carbon that carries into my scope 3. Exactly.
Yeah, that's a way of calculating it. You can go to product level, but that's the way that we advocate, especially if you're early in your journey. Because really, the only thing that everybody knows about their suppliers is what you spent with them. The only thing that universally people know is that. And so that's a fantastic place for procurement people to start that journey. Absolutely, like you say.
Yeah. Yeah, and now I'm assuming that allows me to kind of do a apples to apples comparison across my dollars, right? Because I may have some suppliers that, like you're talking about with Apple, that are reporting very specific, carbon measures at a product level, but I've got maybe somebody else who's not being quite so robust, and then I can't really make those kind of comparisons.
Exactly. Yeah, the point I was making is that IT equipment is one of those areas where there's actually a real rich amount of.
Yeah, no, that's super cool. I hadn't thought even for a minute on, like, when I'm buying a laptop, to be thinking about, is this laptop more or less carbon intensive to create than the other one? Like, who would have thought, right? I mean, maybe looking at it from this side of the conversation now, it seems kind of intuitive, but I'm sure cars and trucks and carpet and all of these products are really quite similar in terms of where they're manufactured, how much shipping and logistics goes into it. All of the rest of these things have really meaningful impact on the carbon footprint.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Stacey, sorry, I can't really see all the screens and see if you're still on, and if that answered your question. If you'd like to dive in a little bit deeper there, we're happy to go a bit deeper, or To everybody, I've known Marc now for, gosh, I don't know, a year and a half, 2 years. Marc is one of the most generous, kind people I know, and I know he'd be more than happy to spend time with you, with any of you, without sending you an invoice. So if you'd like a little bit more, advice and input and kind of figuring out how to look at your program, I'm sure that he'd be happy to help you. The second question from Stacy: is there a charge to receive the graphite climate? You're saying the detailed graphite climate metrics? The summary, so I'm going to differentiate between the detail that Marc showed a few pages ago and the summary level that are within the application. The summary level data is available to all, across all users inside of Graphite for free. Marc has generously made that available as part of our partnership. And the detailed metrics, and maybe I'll just kind of jump back here to, where is it here? To like this level of detail. These details are based on having beyond the 25 kind of free get started, go in there and do some research. This is available based on the relationship that you would have in place with Marc.
Yeah, and just to give you a rough idea, it's between $1 and $2 per supplier, roughly.
So really very affordable, especially if you can look at the summary level information to triage which ones are the ones I care most about, and then dive into the details on the other ones. All right, so I don't see any other questions inside the chat. I think everyone's allowed to unmute themselves. If anyone wants to pipe up and ask a question, let's kind of hold it open for another 30 or 60 seconds here and see if anybody else wants to pipe in with a question. Happy to take them. While we're waiting for that, Marc, thank you for your time. Thank you for your partnership. This is really exciting. I'm very happy to make this available and enrich all of this graphite information, the commercial data, and all the other risk and related data with the data that's available for everybody. Marc, maybe people are asking about your email. Maybe you can pop it into the chat there.
Doing it now.
Your mother's maiden name and your PIN number would be good as well. Excellent. Marc at DitchCarbon.com, Marc with a C. All right, everybody. Thank you so much. Have a very, very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Be safe, and we'll see you on the other side. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Conrad. Thank you, everybody, for joining.